Hey, this is The Difficult Path by Grace Lynn. When I was sold to the Lee family, my mother let Mrs. Lee take me only after she'd promised that I would be taught to read. Her mother had 14 other children starving and clinging to her, yet she was still insisting that I promise. Mrs. Lee sniffed and began a high-pitched imitation. Promise me that when she's 6 you'll have taught her to read. On our ancestor's grave, promise." "You didn't have to agree," Aunty Wang replied peevishly. This was a story she had already heard many times. "A girl learn to read? What a waste!" Mrs. Lee continued, her annoyance at the past greater than Aunty Wang's with the present. "Just because the mother had been a scholar's daughter." "Then you shouldn't have lied," Aunty Wang said, rolling her eyes. She helped herself to some honeyed lychees I held. "I thought she would never know," said Mrs. Lee. "I just said yes so that I could take the baby and go." I made a soft coughing noise and placed the tray on the table. "Mrs. Lee," I said as I bowed low, "teacher is here." She snorted with irritation and waved her arm, her voluminous silk sleeve flapping like a flag of surrender. "Go." She dismissed me. I hid my smile and tried to walk humbly, as all the brow-beaten servants were supposed to do. Unlike Aunty Wang, however, I was not tired of Mrs. Lee's complaining story. I had no memory of my mother, but hearing now how she had dared to make demands of the formidable Mrs. Lee on my behalf always made me feel a sense of pride. Despite my mother's poor circumstances, she must have been spirited. And perhaps it was my mother's spirit that forced Mrs. Lee to keep her promise. For on the day I turned 6, a new tutor came to the house of Lee. As I cringed during my daily duty of emptying the chamber pots, I saw the top of his black scholar's hat glide slowly past the family shrine into the schoolroom. He had come for Mrs. Lee's repulsive only son, Fu Ding, of course. The learned scholar was yet another tutor hired in hopes that Fu Ding could be taught something. The last 2 teachers had departed in disgrace as well as anger, for because Fu Ding remained unable to read a single poem, Mrs. Lee had also refused the tutor's pay. My birthday and a new tutor's entry should have been of small consequence in the house of Lee, except it was also on that day that the incense of the ancestral shrine refused to light. Master Lee tried again and again, but no matter how large a flame he held, the incense would not burn. In desperation, Master Lee turned to the new tutor for answers. "It is apparent," the scholar said, "that you, or perhaps in your household, or someone in your household has shamed your ancestors. Perhaps someone has stolen something, or has broken a promise." "Of course," Master Lee nodded with respect. Then he snapped at Mrs. Lee. "Wife, we have angered our ancestors. What have you done?" The house of Lee roared into a typhoon as all, from the head cook to the lowliest servant, me, were questioned. When it was discovered that it was my 6th birthday, Mrs. Lee remembered her promise to my mother, then paled and swayed like a blanched stalk of bamboo. "It couldn't be," she said in horror. "But it could be, and probably was," the new tutor said, and immediately quoted his price for 2 students. Mrs. Lee, still aghast at the revelation and fending off insults from her husband, did not even haggle over the price. She did try later, claiming that as a girl I should be cheaper, but he responded that because I was a girl he should be paid more, as he was making an exception, so the matter was dropped, and I began my education. That was over 6 years ago. It was also over 6 years ago that I saw my teacher walk in with a new pair of shoes. Those shoes glided on the smooth stone floor, only hesitating as he paused in front of the shrine. With a sharp glance around, he quickly changed the incense, ensuring my lessons and his large salary. "You are late, Ling Si," teacher said, but without anger. He knew Mrs. Lee was always the reason for my tardiness. "Ling Si is late," Fu Ding sneered. I tried to consider Fu Ding with kindness, for it was his inability to read little more than his name that had granted me so many years of lessons. But it was difficult. His body had, over the years, grown into a man's, but he was still the same lazy, spoiled brat he had been as a boy. If anything, the years had made him even more horrible, for now he had a vicious streak that delighted in cruelty. I couldn't help shiver when I saw that he was pulling the legs off crickets again. Today's poem, teacher said, ignoring Fuding, is The Difficult Path by Li Po. I knelt at the table and began to read. I will ride the winds and surmount endless waves, setting sail on the vast ocean. I will one day reach the distant shores. The ocean, I murmured. I had been outside the walled estate of the house of Li only a handful of times. However, one time Shuan, the head cook, and I had been sent to the town to buy pepper, and I had caught a glimpse of the sea. But only a glimpse, for when I tried to see more, I was yanked away. Shuan had a terror of pirates and was convinced that just looking at the sea could make them appear. Li Po writes of endless hardships, teacher said. But you also feel his valiant spirit. I hope this is something you remember, Lingxi. I looked up at him, the question in my eyes, since I dared not ask with my voice. Today is our last lesson, teacher said. Mrs. Li has informed me that Fuding will soon be of marrying age, and his time must be spent in other ways. We both glanced at Fuding, who was creating a pile of dead insects, and then quickly looked away. My eyes filled with tears. I had known that these lessons would not continue forever, but now that they were ending, I felt I could not bear it. You have learned so much, Lingxi, teacher said to me kindly. You are a very smart and clever pupil. If you had been a boy, I have no doubt that you would have won honors at the imperial examination. I tried to smile, but could only bow my head. I felt teacher's hand gently rest upon it. Mencius, the second sage, said that there are 3 joys in the world, he said. Health, a clear conscience, and teaching those who are worthy. Teaching you has been a joy, Lingxi. My tears continued to drop long after our last lesson, long after teacher had left the house of Li, and I had swept up Fuding's collection of insects. They even continued as I scrubbed the pots in the kitchen, much to the annoyance of the other servants. "Stop your crying," Beesie snapped, carrying over dirty bowls for me to wash. "We've got enough to do without listening to your sniffling." "Look at me," Schwan said. "I have to prepare lunch boxes for the entire household, and am I wailing? And Halbo and Moogang and all the men have to prepare those sedan chairs and get ready to carry fat Fuding for hours tomorrow, and they aren't crying either. So your sniveling is not welcome." I gulped and rubbed my face with my sleeve. "Why are we getting lunch boxes and sedan chairs ready?" I asked. "Where is the family going?" "Where are we all going, you mean?" Beezy said. "They're taking all of us this time, even you." "Me?" I asked, surprised. I had assumed that Mrs. Li and the family were going on an extravagant picnic, or visiting Aunt Ju, or some other rich cousin's mansion. "Where? Why?" "It's the first of the month, stupid," Beezy said. "You may have gotten all those fancy lessons and learned to read, but you're still not very smart. They're taking us to the temple service, of course." "The Temple of Longevity is not ours," I began. "We're not going to the Temple of Longevity," Beezy said, with exasperation, but I could see that her frustration was more about the inconvenience than it was for me. "We're off to the Infinite Stream Temple this time." "That huge gold temple by the ocean?" I said. "Why?" "For Fuding, of course," Shuan said. "Mrs. Li hopes she can get the abbot to be a matchmaker for him. Infinite Stream Temple. That's why it's so much money. It gets an infinite stream of brides." "She'll need an elephant's weight of gold to get a matchmaker for Fuding," Beezy grunted. "No matchmaker is going to arrange a marriage with a well-born girl to that rice bucket. You'd think Mrs. Li would know that." "She does. Mrs. Li is no fool. Why do you think—" Shuan stopped, and both servants looked at me oddly. "What?" I asked. As the silence grew longer, I put down the teapot I was washing and glared at them. "What?" I demanded. "Tell me." "By the time Fuding was 7, everyone knew he was a brute as well as an idiot," Shuan said, "and Mrs. Lee knew that he might have a hard time finding a bride. Why do you think Mrs. Lee was so desperate for you, the granddaughter of a scholar?" Beezy said. "She could have gotten any peasant's kid for cheaper and without any silly promises. She wanted a girl of good blood, just in case." I stared. If Mrs. Lee couldn't find a suitable bride, I was going to have to marry Fuding? Me? I felt as if I had eaten spoiled fish. "You're not marrying age yet," Shuan said, trying to be kind. "You'll have a couple of years. That's why Mrs. Lee is trying to find Fuding a bride now. She's hoping she can get someone else to marry Fuding before you have to." "Though I'd say that's a pretty bleak hope," Beezy sniffed. I thought of Fuding and his hairy fingers that were too clumsy to hold a paintbrush, but so adept at torturing bugs. If I had listened more carefully, would I have heard their silent screams? Tears of horror filled my eyes. Shuan heaved an impatient sigh. "You made her cry again," she complained. "Well," Beezy retorted, "at least this time she's got a good reason." The next morning the streets around the house of Lee overflowed with servants, horses, and sedan chairs. Mrs. Lee's chair was so large that it needed 4 men on either side to carry it. Fuding's was not as large, but he was so heavy that the same number of men were needed to carry him. Then the cousins and aunts filled the carriages, and the horses were burdened with the supplies and gifts. Shuan, Beezy, and I were to share a donkey, with the agreement that we would take turns riding, even though I had my doubts about when my turn would be. "It's sheer craziness," Shuan grumbled as we paraded past the gawking neighbors, most of them awed by the grandness of our procession. "Going to the ocean temple carrying chests of jade and strings of cash. We'll be prime targets for robbers. I wouldn't be surprised if pirates docked their boats just to raid us." I remembered Shuan's fear of pirates. "Weren't some pirates seen recently?" I asked slyly. "I think someone said it was the Red Flag Fleet." "I hope not," Shuan said with such fear that I felt a little bad for teasing her. "They are the worst. No one can stop the Red Flag Fleet." "The Imperial Navy has tried 3 times to capture them," Beezy said helpfully, "but failed each time. I heard that the Emperor has even offered amnesty to the captain and the crew if they agree to retire." "Why would they retire?" Shuan said. "They take what they want, and no one can stop them. And here we're going to with all our gold. We might as well be throwing it into the ocean for them." The trip to the Infinite Stream Temple was a long one, but enjoyable. My turn to ride the donkey came much sooner than I had expected, for my short legs could not keep up with the procession, and Shuan was ordered to allow me to ride so that I wouldn't slow down the group. She did this begrudgingly, until I discovered that because I was so small, the donkey could bear the weight of another. So I rode along merrily, enjoying Shuan and Beezy's bickering about who would ride with me. And I marveled oops, and I marveled at all I saw. Even the scrubby, unkempt brush on the dirt road was pleasant to see. Mrs. Lee insisted that her residence be immaculate at all times. Even stray leaves had to be plucked from the paths of the garden. I knew this because clearing the walkways was one of my jobs. But the sea was what mesmerized me. It whispered with a quiet thunder, and when I saw the waves made of dragon scales, just like the one in Lipo's poems, I gasped. However, after 36 twists and turns in the valleys, the Infinite Stream Temple came into view. High on a rocky hill it was impossible to miss, for even from the distance the temple was a brilliance of gold. The temple's bright yellow and red walls and roofs dazzled, a loud, vibrating blare among the soft grays and silvers of the landscapes.